It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. After 2 months of raging protest in Algeria, interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah announced that elections will take place on the 4th of July. Former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika ruled the country for 20 years. But when the 82-year-old and mostly bedridden president announced his intention to run for re-election in February, a massive uprising began against him and against his supporters in the government. Bouteflika relented and said that he would not stand for re-election, but rather postpone the elections. That did very little to quell the protests, and on Tuesday, Bouteflika finally agreed to step down, triggering the automatic appointment of the President of the National Council, the upper house of Parliament, to take the role of interim president. Abdelkader Ben Salah was sworn in as interim president for 90 days. Now, protests in Algiers have not really subsided in spite of all of this. The appointment of the interim president did very little. Let's listen.
We have come out today in order to oppose Ben Salah. Ben Salah, leave. We don't need you.
We are here today for the demands of the people, the demands of the people. Meet the demands of the people. Let the people come out victorious. That is all.
We are here so the ones who are governing the country leave, because they are robbing and not building the country. They are destroying it.
Joining me now to discuss the situation in Algeria is Baba Ai. Baba is the policy officer for the Health and Social Services of Public Services International, a global trade union federation. Baba, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sharmini. It's my pleasure.
So, Baba, have the protesters achieved what they wanted, a sort of a forced resignation of not only Bouteflika, but this entire government to step aside for a new generation of leaders to take over?
I would say it itself represents a new generation in Algeria that is not held down by the dark moments of the 1990s. You could say somewhat the first phase of the Arab Spring kind of passed Algeria by, partly because you had what you could say carrot and stick. The carrot was, the stick was more historical. The civil war of the 1990s stood in people's mind as how dangerous times could be when you had serious conflict. Then there was also the carrot of state subsidies, of a state that used the rains from oil to try give a relatively decent living standard. And I mean, you should have in mind that Algeria is the country with the least level of inequality in Africa, with a Gini coefficient of 27.6, as against Nigeria, for example, of 43. And on the other side, at the other end, South Africa with 63.4. So, but all this kind of started to fall apart with the collapse in the price of oil in the international market by 2014 thereabout, and you had rising prices of commodities and cuts in subsidies and shortage of fuel and rising youth unemployment at like 30% by last year. So you had a young population of working class people that were not only angry, but were not held back by some of what the older generation could cast their mind back to of the 1990s civil war. And in the particular case of Algeria, you have had this reawakening, this being at the fore, you might say, of the second phase of the Arab Spring, and part of the resurgence of working people and youth in struggle to create such spaces as what you now see in Algeria and as well in Sudan.
Okay, now let's talk about the nature of the uprising. You identify them as young people, and that this is a late Arab Spring. What is it that they want, and what is the political composition of this uprising in Algiers?
We're talking of working class people. These are youth mainly from a working class background, and it's important to note that you had series of strikes in the dying days of Bouteflika, which played a decisive role in convincing the deep state that it was not enough for Bouteflika to say he would not seek re-election, but there was a need to sacrifice him in their collective interest. You know, it was even in the first place something like the El Cid legend in their collective interest. So what you have here is the trade union movement, the UJTA, but interestingly, because you have had cooptation as well as repression as the strategy of the FLN over the past couple of decades. So you had the UJT having some ties sort of with the state, which had been loosened over the past decade thereabout, but still there, which is why a lot of the strikes that you had were what you would say were illegal strikes, because they did not, of course, go through the due process in quote, you know. So the composition would you say workers, youth, professionals, middle class elements, and then you had, and which is something that is not at all unusual in moments like this, you had sections of the ruling class, you know, crossing over to the popular sector of the masses in motion, the masses moving to change their realities. So you now have the deep state trying to manage the situation, trying to deflect the mass revolution from below into safer waters of contrived electoralism for July. And that is what Ben Salah's role as a symbol for the deep state, that is what it stands for. That is the role they are playing. So a lot depends on in the next couple of months. A lot depends on the working class not getting sucked into electoralist illusions, which the deep state is trying to sow, trying to make it appear that the problem was strictly about Bouteflika. So I want to say also here the role of imperialist forces. It's quite interesting that despite the earlier spring and the errors made by the American imperialism in particular, and Britain, when you had Mubarak thinking that he could manage it, you had a similar fox barber from Macron, who commended Bouteflika's saying he would not contest, but not seeing that it could get this far. But you can expect behind the scenes France, which still benefits immensely from its new colonial ties with Algeria, to pull strings to try and ensure that the safe waters of electoralism is where this mass movement would flow into. But and this is quite important to note from the positions of a lot of people on the streets. They are rather emboldened to go forward with the struggle. What we will now have, the challenge would be, what parties stand up? Do you have parties that would take this issue beyond just parliamentary struggle. What does down with the system mean? Should it go beyond just down with Bouteflika and his immediate circle? I would think that tens of thousands, if not millions, of working class people and youth in Algeria would want to take this forward, would be ready to take the struggle forward. But a lot depends on leadership emerging from this and the contention between the right wing, which right now is a wolf in sheep clothing, and look also at Zimbabwe, Sudan, Egypt. You see the same trend.
Baba, Bouteflika, of course, was a significant figure all these years. The anti-colonial movement and the struggle against the French was somewhat embodied in Bouteflika. If you would ode to him in terms of a departing statement.
Well, I would say Bouteflika is a good example of national liberation movement's limitations. It's interesting to know that he was quite close to Frantz Fanon, and he was part of, from the time of Ben Bella, Boumediene, and Ben Jedid, the first three presidents. They were part and parcel of the struggle, very bloody struggle against French imperialism, French colonialism, and in the 70s they played a role in making Algiers the center for radicals and revolutionaries, from the Viet Congs to the Black Panther Party and so on and so forth. But and this is the important bit to note. We are seeing similar situations with the ANC in South Africa, where subsequent to liberation, movement's leadership now rather becomes what the colonial masters wear, but with indigenous skins, and that is why it is important to place class at the center of national liberation. So I would say that farewell to national liberation that situates itself within the capitalist paradigm of development, even where and when it espouses socialist rhetoric, as the Front for the National Liberation Front did in its early days and decades. What we need now is, it might sound like a cliche, but not exactly. I would say we need the revolution in permanence.
I've been speaking with Baba Ai. He is editor of The Socialist Worker in Nigeria, as well as he's editor with the Review of African Political Economy. I thank you so much for joining us today, Baba.
Thank you very much, Shamini. My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.